Chapter 24 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 24 The Torpedo Boat Destroyer. Before Vickers and his companions had recovered from the surprise which this extraordinary cool message had given them, the men had bundled Chatfield across the beach and into the boat and were pulling quickly back to the Pike. Audrey broke the silence with a ringing laugh. "Captain Andrius is certainly the perfection of polite pirates!" she exclaimed. "More food, more wraps, and books and papers! Was any marooned mariner ever one half so well treated?" "What's the fellow mean about no vessel passing here for 2 more days?" growled Copplestone, who was glaring angrily at the yacht. "What's he so meticulously correct for?" "I should say that he's referring to some weekly or bi weekly steamer which runs between Kirkwall and the mainland," replied Vickers. "Well, it's good to know that, anyhow. But wait until the Pike's vamoosed again, and we'll make up such a column of smoke that it'll be seen for many a mile. In fact, I'll go and gather a lot of dried stuff now. You two can drag those boxes and things up the beach and see what our gaolers have been good enough to send us." He went away up the cliffs, and Audrey and Copplestone, once more left alone, looked at each other and laughed. "That's right," said Copplestone. "What I like about you is that you take things that way." "Is it any use taking them any other way?" she asked. "Besides, I've never been at all frightened, nor particularly concerned. I've always felt that we were only put here so that we should be out of the way while our captors got safely away with their booty, and as regards my mother, I know her well enough to feel sure that she quickly sized things up, and that she'll have taken measures of her own. Don't be surprised if we're rescued through her means, or if she has set somebody to work to catch the predatory Pike." "Good!" said Copplestone. "But as regards the Pike, I wonder if you observed something during the few minutes she was here? I'm sure Vickers didn't he was too busy watching Chatfield." "So was I," replied Audrey. "What was it?" "I believe I'm unusually observant," answered Copplestone. "I seem to see things all at once, don't you know. I saw that since we made her acquaintance, and were unceremoniously bundled off her, the Pike has got a new and quite different coat of paint. And I daresay she's changed her name, too. From all of which I argue that when they got rid of us here, the people who are working all this slipped quietly back to some cove or creek on the Scotch coast, did a stiff turn at repainting, and meant to be off to the other side of the world under new colours. And while this was going on, Andrius, or his co villain, found time to examine those chests that Chatfield told us of, and when they found that Chatfield had done them, they came back here quick. Now they're off to make him reveal the whereabouts of the real chests." "Won't they be rather running their necks into a noose?" suggested Audrey. "I'm dead certain that my mother will have raised a hue and cry after them." "They're cute enough," said Copplestone. "Anyway, they'll run a good many risks for the sake of £50,000. What they may do is to run into some very quiet inlet there are hundreds on these northern coasts and take Chatfield to his hiding place. Chatfield's like all scoundrels of his type a horrible coward if a pistol's held to his head. Now they've got him, they'll force him to disgorge. Hang this compulsory inactivity! My nerves are all a tingle to get going at things." "Let's occupy ourselves with the things our generous gaolers have been kind enough to send us, then," suggested Audrey. "We'd better carry them up to our shelter." Copplestone went down to the things which the boat's crew had deposited on the beach a couple of small packing cases, a bundle of wraps and cushions, and some books, magazines and newspapers. He picked up a paper with a cry which suggested a discovery of importance. "Look at that!" he exclaimed. "Do you see? A Scotsman! Today's date! And here Aberdeen Free Press same date." "Well?" asked Audrey. "And what then?" "What then?" demanded Copplestone. "Where are your powers of deduction? Why, that shows that the Pike was somewhere this morning where she could get the morning papers from Aberdeen and Edinburgh. Therefore, she's been, as I suggested, somewhere on the Scotch coast all night. It's now noon. She's a fast sailer. I guess she's been within 60 miles of us ever since she left us." "Isn't it more pertinent to speculate on where she'll be when we want to find her?" asked Audrey. "More pertinent still to wonder when somebody will come to find us," answered Copplestone as he shouldered one of the cases. "However, there's a certain joy in uncertainty, so they say. We're tasting it." The joys of uncertainty, however, were not to endure. They had scarcely completed the task of carrying up the newly arrived stores to the shelter which they had made in an angle of the rocks when Vickers hailed them from a spur of the cliffs and waved his arms excitedly.
"I say, you two!" he shouted. "There's a craft coming from the southwest! Come up! There!" he added a few minutes later, when they arrived, breathless, at his side. "Out yonder a mere black blot, but unmistakable. Do you know what that is, either of you? You don't? All right, I do. Ought to, because I'm an R.N.V.R. man myself. That's a T.B.D., my friends. Torpedo boat destroyer. What's more, far off as she is, my experienced eye and sure knowledge tell me exactly what she is. She's a Class H boat built last year oil fuel, turbines, runs up to 30 knots and she's doing 'em, too, just now. Come on, Copplestone more stuff on this fire." "I don't think we need be uneasy," said Copplestone. "Miss Greyle thinks that her mother will have raised a hue and cry after the Pike. This torpedo thing is probably looking round for us. She what's that?" The sudden sharp crack of a gun came across the calm surface of the sea, and the watchers turning from their fire towards the black object in the distance saw a cloud of white smoke drifting away from it. "Hooray!" shouted Vickers. "She's seen our smoke pillar! Shove more on, just to let her know we understand. Saved! This time, anyway."
Half an hour later a spick and span and eminently youthful looking naval lieutenant raised his cap to the three folk who stood eagerly awaiting his approach at the edge of the surf. "Miss Greyle Mr. Vickers Mr. Copplestone?" he asked as he sprang from his boat and came up. "Right we're searching for you had wireless messages this morning. Where's the pirate, or whatever he is?" "Somewhere away to the southward," answered Vickers, pointing into the haze. "He was here 2 hours ago, but he's about as fast as they make 'em. And he's good reason to show a clean pair of heels. However, we've ample grounds for believing him to have gone due south again. Where are you from?" "Got the message off Dunnet Head, and we'll run you to Thurso," replied the rescuer, motioning them to enter the boat. "Come on our commander's got some word or other for you. What's all this been?" he went on, gazing at Audrey with youthful assurance as they moved away from the shore. "You don't mean to say you've actually been kidnapped?" "Kidnapped and marooned," replied Vickers. "And I hope you'll catch our kidnapper. He's got a tremendous amount of property on him which belongs to this lady, and he'll make tracks for the other side of the Atlantic as soon as he gets hold of some more, which he's gone to collect." The lieutenant regarded Audrey with still more interest. "Oh, all right," he said confidently. "He'll not get away. I guess they've wirelessed all over the place. Our message was from the Admiralty." "That's Sir Cresswell's doing," said Copplestone, turning to Audrey. "Your mother must have wired to him. I wonder what the message is?" he asked, facing the lieutenant. "Do you know?" "Something about if you're found to tell you to get south as fast as possible," he answered. "And we've worked that out for you. You can get on by train from Thurso to Inverness, and from Inverness, of course, you'll get the Southern Express. We'll put you off at Thurso by 2 o'clock, just time to give you such lunch as our table affords bit rough, you know. So you've really been all night on that island?" he went on with unaffected curiosity. "What a lark!" "You'd have had an opportunity of studying character if you'd been with us," replied Vickers. "We lost a fine specimen of humanity 2 hours ago." "Tell about it aboard," said the lieutenant. "We'll be thankful. We've been round this end of everywhere coast for a month, and we're tired. It's quite a godsend to have a little adventure." Copplestone had been right in surmising that Sir Cresswell Oliver had bestirred himself to find him and his companions. They were presently shown his message. They were to get to Norcaster as quickly as possible, and to wire their whereabouts as soon as they were found. If, as seemed likely, They were picked up on the north coast of Scotland. They were to ask at Inverness railway station for telegrams. And to Inverness, after being landed at Thurso, they betook themselves, while the torpedo boat destroyer set off to nose round for the Pike, in case she came that way back from wherever she had gone to. Copplestone came out of the station master's office at Inverness with a couple of telegrams, and read their contents over to his companions in the dining room to which they had adjourned. "This is from Mrs. Greyle," he said. "All right and much relieved by a wire from Thurso. Bring Audrey home as quick as possible. That's good. And this Great Scott! This is from Gilling. Listen! Just heard from Petherton of your rescue. Come straight and sharp Norcaster. Meet me at the 'Angel.' Big things afoot. Spurge most anxious to see you. Important news. Gilling." "So things have been going on," he concluded, turning the second telegram over to Vickers. "I suppose we'll have to travel all night." "Night express in an hour," replied Vickers. "We shall make Norcaster about 5:30 tomorrow morning." "Then let us wire the time of our arrival to Gilling. I'm anxious to know what has brought him up there," said Copplestone. "And we'll wire to Mrs. Greyle, too," he added, turning to Audrey. "She'll know then that you're absolutely on the way." "I wonder what we're on the way to?" remarked Vickers with a grim smile. "It strikes me that our recent alarms and excursions will have been as nothing to what awaits us at Norcaster." What did await them on a cold, dismal morning at Norcaster was Gilling, stamping up and down a wind swept platform. And Gilling seized on Copplestone almost before he could alight from the train. "Come to the 'Angel' straight off," he said. "Mrs. Greyle's there awaiting her daughter. I've work for you and Vickers at once. That chap Spurge is somewhere about the 'Angel' too been hanging round there since yesterday, heavy with news that he'll give to nobody but you." Chapter 25 Scarhaven Keep. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 25 The Squire. Such of the folk of the Angel Hotel a night porter, a waiter, a chambermaid as were up and about that grey morning, wondered why the two old gentlemen who had arrived from London the day before should rise from their beds to hold a secret and mysterious conference with the three young ones who, with a charming if tired looking young lady, drove up before the city clocks had struck 6. But Sir Cresswell Oliver and Mr. Petherton knew that there was no time to be lost, and as soon as Audrey had been restored to and carried off by her mother to Mrs. Greyle's room, they summoned Vickers and Copplestone to a private parlour and demanded their latest news. Sir Cresswell listened eagerly and in silence until Copplestone described the return of the Pike. At that he broke his silence. "That's precisely what I feared!" he exclaimed. "Of course, if she's been hurriedly repainted and renamed, she stands a fair chance of getting away. Our instructions to the patrol boats up there are to look for a certain vessel, the Pike. Naturally, they won't look for anything else. We must get the wireless to work at once." "But there's this," said Copplestone. "They certainly fetched old Chatfield to make him hand over the gold. They won't go away without that. And he said that he'd hidden the gold somewhere near Scarhaven. Therefore, they'll have to come down this coast to get it." "Not necessarily," replied Sir Cresswell, with a knowing shake of the head. "You may be sure they're alive to all the exigencies of the situation. They could do several things once they'd got Chatfield on board again. Some of them could land with him at some convenient port and make him take them to where he's hidden the money. They could recapture that and go off to some other port to which the yacht had meanwhile been brought round. If we only knew where Chatfield had planted that money!" "He said near Scarhaven, unmistakably," remarked Vickers. "Near Scarhaven!" repeated Sir Cresswell, laughing dismally. "That's a wide term a very wide one. Behind Scarhaven, as you all know, are hills and moors and valleys and ravines in which one could hide a dreadnought. Well, that's all I can think of. getting into communication with patrol boats and coastguard stations all along the coast between here and Wick. And that mayn't be the least good. Somebody may have escorted Chatfield ashore after they left you yesterday, brought him hereabouts by rail or motor car, and the yacht may have made a wide detour round the Shetlands and be now well on her way to the North Atlantic." "But in that case the money?" asked Copplestone. "They would get hold of the money, take it clean away, and ship it from Liverpool, or Glasgow, or anywhere," replied Sir Cresswell. "You may be sure they've plenty of resources at command, and that they'll work secretly. Of course, we must keep a lookout round about here for any sign or reappearance of Chatfield, but, as I say, this country is so wild that he and his companions can easily elude observation, especially as they're sure to come by night. Still, we must do what we can, and at once. But first, there are one or two things I want to ask you young men. You said, Mr. Vickers, that Chatfield solemnly insisted to you that he did not know that the man who had posed as Marston Greyle was not Marston Greyle." "He did," replied Vickers, "and though Chatfield is an unmitigated old scoundrel, I believe him." "You do!" exclaimed Gilling, who was listening eagerly. "Oh, come!" "I do as a professional man," answered Vickers stoutly, and with an appealing glance at his brother solicitor. "Mr. Petherton will tell you that we lawyers have a curious gift of intuition. With all Chatfield's badness, I do really believe that the old fellow does not know whether the man we'll call the Squire is Marston Greyle or not. He's doubtful, he's puzzled, but he doesn't know." "Odd!" murmured Sir Cresswell, after a minute's silence. "Odd very, very odd. That shows that there's still some extraordinary mystery about this which we haven't even guessed at. Well, now, another question you got the idea that someone else was aboard the yacht?" "Someone other than Andrius, in authority, yes," answered Vickers. "We certainly thought that." "Did you think it was the man we know as the Squire?" asked Sir Cresswell. "We had a notion that he might be there," replied Vickers, with a glance at Copplestone. "Especially after what happened to Chatfield. Of course, we never saw him, or heard his voice, or saw a sign of him. Still, we fancied " Sir Cresswell rose from his chair and motioned to Petherton. "Well," he said, "I think you and I, Petherton, had better complete our toilets, and then give a look in at the authorities here and find out if anything has been received by wireless, or from the coastguard stations about the yacht. In the meantime," he added, turning to Vickers and Copplestone, "Gilling can tell you what's been going on in your absence. You'll learn from it that our impression is that the Squire, as we call him, was on the Pike with you." The two elder men went away, and Copplestone turned to Gilling. "What have you got?" he asked eagerly. "Live news!" "Might have been livelier and more satisfactory," answered Gilling, "if it hadn't been for the factor which none of us can help luck. We tracked the Squire." "You did?" exclaimed Copplestone. "Where?" "When I said we, I should have said Swallow," continued Gilling. "You remember that afternoon of our return from Bristol, Copplestone? It seems ages away now, though as a matter of time it's only 4 days ago. Well, that afternoon, Swallow, who had had 2 or 3 more keeping a sharp lookout for the Squire, got a telephone message from one of 'em saying that he'd tracked his man to the Fragonard Club. I'd gone home to my chambers, to rest a bit after our adventures at Bristol and Falmouth, so Swallow had to act on his own initiative. He set off for the Fragonard Club, and outside it met his man. This particular man had been keeping a watch for days on that tobacconist's shop in Wardour Street. That afternoon he suddenly saw the Squire leave it by a side door. He followed him to the Fragonard Club, watched him enter. Then he himself turned into a neighbouring bar and telephoned to Swallow. The Squire was still in the Fragonard when Swallow got there. From that time he kept a watch. The Squire remained in the club for an hour." "Which proves," interrupted Copplestone, "that he's a member, and that I ought to have followed up my attempt to get in there." "Well, anyway," continued Gilling, "there he was, and thence he eventually emerged, with a kit bag. He got into a taxi, and Swallow heard him order its driver to go to King's Cross. Now Swallow was there alone. and he had just before that met his man scooting round to see if there was a rear exit from the Fragonard, and he hadn't returned. Swallow, of course, couldn't wait every minute was precious. He followed the Squire to King's Cross, and heard him book for Northborough." "Northborough!" exclaimed Copplestone in surprise. "Not Norcaster? Ah, well, Northborough's a port too, isn't it?" "Northborough is as near to Scarhaven as Norcaster, you know," said Gilling. "To Northborough he booked, anyhow. So did Swallow, who, now that he'd got him, was going to follow him to the North Pole if need be. The train was just starting Swallow had no time to communicate with me. Also, the train didn't stop until it reached Grantham. There he sent me a wire saying he was on the track of his man. Well, they went on to Northborough, where they arrived late in the evening. There what is it, Copplestone?" he broke off, seeing signs of a desire to speak on Copplestone's part. "You're talking of the very same afternoon and evening that I came down 4 evenings ago," said Copplestone. "My train was the 4 o'clock. I got to Norcaster at 10. Surely they didn't come on the same train?" "I feel sure they did, but, anyhow, these trains to the north are usually very long ones, and you were probably in a different part," replied Gilling. "Anyway, they got to Northborough soon after 9. Swallow followed his man on to the platform, out to some taxi cabs, and heard him commission one of the chauffeurs to take him to Scarhaven. When they'd gone, Swallow got hold of another taxi and told its driver to take him to Scarhaven too. Off they went, in a pitch black night, I'm told." "We know that," said Vickers with a glance at Copplestone. "We motored from Norcaster just about the same time." "Well," continued Gilling, "it was at any rate so dark that Swallow's driver, who appears to have been a very nervous chap, made very poor progress. Also, he took 1 or 2 wrong turnings. Finally, he ran his car into a guide post which stood where 2 roads forked, and there Swallow was landed, scarcely half way to Scarhaven. They couldn't get the car to move, and it was some time before Swallow could persuade the landlord at the nearest inn to hire out a horse and trap to him. Altogether, it was near or just past midnight when he reached Scarhaven, and when he did get there, it was to see the lights of a steamer going out of the bay." "The Pike, of course!" muttered Copplestone. "Of course and some men on the quay told him," continued Gilling. "Well, that put Swallow in a fix. He was dead certain, of course, that his man was on that yacht. However, he didn't want to rouse suspicion, so he didn't ask any of those quayside men if they'd seen the Squire. Instead, remembering what I'd told him about Mrs. Greyle, he asked for her house and was directed to it. He found Mrs. Greyle in a state of great anxiety. Her daughter had gone with you two to the yacht and had never returned. Mrs. Greyle, watching from her windows, had seen the yacht go out to sea. Swallow found her, of course, seriously alarmed as to what had happened. Of course, he told her what he had come down for, and they consulted. Next morning " "Stop a bit!" interrupted Vickers. "Didn't Mrs. Greyle get any message from the yacht about her daughter? Andrius said he'd sent one, anyway." "A lie!" replied Gilling. "She got no message. The only consolation she had was that you and Copplestone were with Miss Greyle. Well, first thing next morning Swallow and Mrs. Greyle set every possible means to work. They went to the police; they wired to places up the coast and down the coast to keep a lookout; and Swallow also wired full particulars to Sir Cresswell Oliver, with the result that Sir Cresswell went to the naval authorities and got them to set their craft up north to work. Having done all this, and finding that he could be of no more service at Scarhaven, Swallow returned to town to see me and to consult. Now, of course, we were in a position by then to approach that Fragonard Club." "Ah!" exclaimed Copplestone. "Just so!" "The man, whoever he is, had been there an hour on the day Swallow and his man tracked him," continued Gilling. "Therefore, something must be known of him. Swallow and I, armed with certain credentials, went there. And we could find out next to nothing. The hall porter there said he dimly remembered such a gentleman coming in and going upstairs, but he himself was new to his job, didn't know all the members there are hundreds of 'em and he took this man for a regular habitué. The waiter also had some sort of recollection of the man, and seeing him in conversation with another man whom he, the waiter, knew better, though he didn't know his name. Swallow is now moving everything to find that man. to find anybody who knows our man, and something will come of it in the end must do. In the meantime, I came down here with Sir Cresswell and Mr. Petherton to be on the spot. And from your information, things will happen here. That hidden gold is the thing they'll not leave that without an effort to get it. If we could only find where that is and watch it, then our present object would be achieved." "What is the present object?" asked Copplestone. "Why," replied Gilling, "we've got warrants out against both Chatfield and the Squire for the murder of Bassett Oliver. The police here have them in hand Petherton's seen to that. And if they can only be laid hands on what is it?" he asked, turning to a sleepy eyed waiter who, after a gentle tap at the door, put a shock head into the room. "Somebody want me?" "That there man, sir, you know," said the waiter. "Here again, sir. Stable yard, sir." Gilling jumped up and gave Copplestone a look. "That's Spurge!" he muttered. "He said he'd be back at daybreak. Wait here I'll fetch him." Chapter 25 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 26 The Reaver's Glen. Zachary Spurge, presently ushered in by Gilling, who carefully closed the door behind himself and his companion, looked as if his recent lodging had been of an even rougher nature than that in which Copplestone had found him at their first meeting. The rough horseman's cloak in which he was buttoned to the edge of a red neckerchief and a stubbly chin was liberally ornamented with bits of straw, scraps of furze and other odds and ends picked up in woods and hedgerows. Spurge, indeed, bore unmistakable evidence of having slept out in wild places for some nights, and his general atmosphere was little more respectable than that of a scarecrow. But he grinned cheerfully at Copplestone and then frowned at Vickers. "I didn't count for to meet no lawyers, gentlemen," he said, pausing on the outer boundaries of the parlour. "I ain't a going to talk before 'em, neither." "He's a grudge against me I've had to appear against him once or twice," whispered Vickers to Copplestone. "You'd better soothe him down I want to know what he's got to tell." "It's all right, Spurge," said Copplestone. "Come Mr. Vickers is on our side this time he's one of us. You can say anything you like before him or Mr. Gilling, either. We're all in it. Pull your chair up here, alongside of me and tell us what you've been doing." "Well, of course, if you puts it that way, Mr. Copplestone," replied Spurge, coming to the table a little doubtfully. "Though I hadn't meant to tell nobody but you what I've got to tell. However, I can see that things is in such a pretty pass that this here ain't no one man job. It's a job as'll want a lot o' men, and I dare say lawyers and such like is as useful men in that way as you can lay hands on. No offence to you, Mr. Vickers, only you see I've had experience o' your sort before. But if you are taking a hand in this here well, all right. But now, gentlemen," he continued, dropping into a chair at the table and laying his fur cap on its polished surface, "afore ever I says a word, do you think that I could be provided with a cup o' hot coffee, or tea, with a stiff dose o' rum in it? I'm that cold and starved. Ah, if you'd been where I've been these last 12 hours or so, you'd be perished." The sleepy waiter was summoned to attend to Spurge's wants. Until they were satisfied, the poacher sat staring fixedly at his cap and occasionally shaking his head. But after a first hearty gulp of strongly fortified coffee, the colour came back into his face, and he sighed with relief and signalled to the three watchful young men to draw their chairs close to his. "Ah!" he said, setting down his cup. "And nobody never wanted aught more badly than I wanted that! And now then the door being shut on us quite safe, ain't it, gentlemen? No eavesdroppers? Well, this here it is. I don't know what you've been a doing of these last few days, nor what may have happened to each and all, but I've news serious news, as I reckons it to be, of Chatfield." Copplestone kicked Vickers under the table and gave him a look. "Chatfield again!" he murmured. "Well, go on, Spurge." "There's a lot to go on with, too, guv'nor," said Spurge, after taking another evidently welcome drink. "And I'll try to put it all in order, as it were, Same as if I was in a witness box," he added, with a sly glance at Vickers. "You remember that day of the inquest on the actor gentleman, guv'nor? Well, of course, when I went to give evidence at Scarhaven at that there inquest, I never expected but what the police'd collar me at the end of it. However, I didn't mean that they should, if I could help it, so I watched things pretty close, intending to slip off when I saw a chance. Well, now, you'll bear in mind that there was a bit of a dust up when the thing was over, some on 'em cheering the Squire and some on 'em grousing about the verdict, and between one and the other, I popped out and off, and you yourself saw me making for the moors. Of course, me, knowing them moors back o' Scarhaven as I do, it was easy work to make myself scarce on 'em in 10 minutes. Not all the police north of the Tees could have found me a quarter of an hour after I'd hooked it out of that schoolroom. Well, but the thing then was where to go next. 'Twasn't no good going to Hobkin's Hole again. Now that them chaps knew I was in the neighbourhood, they'd soon 'a smoked me out o' there. Once I thought o' making for Norcaster here, and going into hiding down by the docks I've one or two harbours o' refuge there. But I had reasons for wishing to stop in my own country for a bit, at any rate. And so, after reckoning things up, I made for a spot as Mr. Vickers there'll know by name of the Reaver's Glen." "Good place, too, for hiding," remarked Vickers with a nod. "Best place on this coast, seashore and inland," said Spurge. "And as you two London gentlemen doesn't know it, I'll tell you about it. If you was to go out o' Scarhaven harbour and turn north, you'd sail along our coast line up here to the mouth of Norcaster Bay, and you'd think there was never an inlet between 'em. But there is. About half way between Scarhaven and Norcaster there's a very narrow opening in the cliffs that you'd never notice unless you were close in shore, and inside that opening there's a cove that's big enough to take a 1,000-ton vessel aye, and half a dozen of 'em. It was a favourite place for smugglers in the old days, and they call it Darkman's Dean to this day, in memory of a famous old smuggler that used it a good deal. Well, now, at the land end of that cove there's a narrow valley that runs up to the moorland and the hills, full o' rocks and crags and precipices and such like, something of the same sort as Hobkin's Hole, but a deal wilder, and that's known as the Reaver's Glen, because in other days the cattle lifters used to bring their stolen goods, cattle and sheep, down there, where they could pen 'em in, as it were. There's piles o' places in that glen where a man can hide. I picked out one right at the top, at the edge o' the moors, where there's the ruins of an old peel tower. I could get shelter in that old tower, and at the same time slip out of it, if need be, into one of 50 likely hiding places amongst the rocks. I got into touch with my cousin, Jim Spurge, the one eyed chap at the Admiral's Arms, Mr. Copplestone, that night, and I got in a supply of meat and drink, and there I was. And as things turned out, Chatfield had got his eye on the very same spot." Spurge paused for a minute, and picking out a match from a stand which stood on the table, began to trace imaginary lines on the mahogany. "This is how things is there," he said, inviting his companion's attention. "Here, like, is where this peel tower stands. That's a thick wood as comes close up to its walls. That there is a road as crosses the moors and the wood about, maybe, 100 yards or so behind the tower on the land side. Now there, one afternoon as I was in that there tower, a reading of a newspaper that Jim had brought me the night before, I hears wheels on that moorland road, and I looked out through a convenient loophole, and who should I see but Peter Chatfield and that old pony trap of his. He was coming along from the direction of Scarhaven, and when he got abreast of the tower he pulled up, got out, left his pony to crop the grass, and came strolling over in my direction. O' course, I wasn't afraid of him. There's so many ways in and out of that old peel as there is out of a rabbit warren. Besides, I felt certain he was there on some job of his own. Well, he comes up to the edge of the glen, and he looks into it and round it, and up and down at the tower, and he wanders about the heaps of fallen masonry that there is there, and finally he puts thumbs in his armhole and went back to his trap. 'But you'll be coming back, my old swindler,' says I to myself. 'You'll be back again, I doubt not at all.' And back he did come, that very night. Oh, yes!" "Alone?" asked Copplestone. "Alone!" replied Spurge. "It had got to be dark, and I was thinking o' going to sleep, having naught else to do, and not expecting cousin Jim that night, when I heard the sound of horses' feet and of wheels. So I cleared out of my hole to where I could see better. Of course it was Chatfield, same old trap and pony, but this time he came from Norcaster way. Well, he gets out just where he'd got out before, and he leads the pony and trap across the moor to close by the tower. I could tell by the way that trap went over the grass that there was some sort of a load in it, and it wouldn't have surprised me, gentlemen, if the old reptile had brought a dead body out of it. After a bit I hear him taking something out, something which he bumped down on the ground with a thump. I counted 9 of them thumps. And then after a bit I heard him begin a moving of some of the loose masonry that lies in such heaps at the foot of the peel tower. Dark though it was, there was light enough in the sky for him to see to do that. But after he'd been at it some time, puffing and groaning and grunting, he evidently wanted to see better, and he suddenly flashed a light on things from one of them electric torches. And then I see it, me being not so many yards away from him, 9 small white wood boxes, all clamped with metal bands, lying in a row on the grass, and I see, too, that Chatfield had been making a place for 'em amongst the stones. Yes, that was it, 9 small white wood boxes, so small, considerin', that I wondered what made 'em so heavy. Copplestone favoured Vickers with another quiet kick. They were, without doubt, hearing the story of the hidden gold, and it was becoming exciting. Well, continued Spurge, into the place he'd cleared out them boxes went, and once they were all in he heaped the stones over 'em as natural as they were before, and he kicked a lot o' small loose stones round about and over the place where he'd been standing. And then the old sinner let out a great groan as if something troubled him, and he fetched a bottle out of his pocket and took a good pull at whatever was in it, after which, gentlemen, he wiped his forehead with his handkerchief and groaned again. He'd had his bit o' light on all that time, but he doused it then, and after that he led the old pony away across the bit o' moor to the road, and presently in he gets and drives slowly away towards Scarhaven. And so there was I, d'ye see, Mr. Copplestone, left, as it were, sole guardian of what? The 3 young men exchanged glances with each other while Spurge refreshed himself with his fortified coffee, and their eyes asked similar questions. "Ah!" observed Copplestone at last. "You don't know what, Spurge? You haven't examined one of those boxes?" Spurge set his cup down and gave his questioner a knowing look. "I'll tell you my line o' conduct, guv'nor," he said. "So certain sure have I been that something 'ud come o' this business of hiding them boxes, and that something valuable is in 'em, that I've taken particular care ever since Chatfield planted 'em there that night never to set foot within a dozen yards of 'em. Why? 'Cause I know he'll ha' left footprints of his own there, and them footprints may be useful. No, sir, them boxes has been guarded careful ever since Chatfield placed 'em where he did. For Chatfield's never been back." "Never back, eh?" said Copplestone, winking at the other two. "Never been back, self nor spirit, substance nor shadow, since that night," replied Spurge. "Unless, indeed, he's been back since 4 o'clock this morning, when I left there. However, if he's been 'twixt then and now, my cousin Jim Spurge, he was there Jim's been helping me to watch. When I first came in here to see if I could hear anything about you, Jim having told me that some London gentleman was up here again, I left him in charge. And there he is now. Now you know all I can tell you, gentlemen, and as I understand there's some mystery about Chatfield and that he's disappeared, happen you'll know how to put 2 and 2 together. And if I'm of any use " "Spurge," said Gilling, "how far is it to this Reaver's Glen or rather to that peel tower?" "Matter of 8 or 9 miles, guv'nor, over the moors," replied Spurge. "How did you come in, then?" asked Gilling. "Cousin Jim Spurge's bike down in the stable yard now," answered Spurge. "Did it comfortable and under the hour." "I think we ought to go out there, some of us," said Gilling. "We ought " At that moment the door opened, and Sir Cresswell Oliver came in, holding a bit of flimsy paper in his hand. He glanced at Spurge and then beckoned the 3 young men to join him. "I've had a wireless message from the North Sea, and it puzzles me," he said. "One of our ships up there has had news of what is surely the Pike from a fishing vessel. She was seen late yesterday afternoon going due east. Due east, mind you. If that was she, and I'm sure of it, our quarry's escaping us." Chapter 27 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 27 The Peel Tower. Gilling took the message from Sir Cresswell and thoughtfully read it over. Then he handed it back and motioned the old seaman to look at Spurge. "I think you ought to know what this man has just told us, sir," he said. "We've got a story from him that exactly fits in with what Chatfield told Mr. Vickers when the Pike returned to carry him off yesterday. Chatfield, you'll remember, said that the gold he'd withdrawn from the bank is hidden somewhere. Well, there's no doubt that this man Zachary Spurge knows where it is hidden. It's there now and the presumption is, of course, that these people on the Pike will certainly come into this coast, somehow, to get it. So in that case eh?" "Gad! That's valuable!" said Sir Cresswell, glancing again at Spurge, and with awakened interest. "Let me hear this story." Copplestone epitomized Spurge's account, while the poacher listened admiringly, checking off the main points and adding a word or two where he considered the epitome lacking. "Very smart of you, my man," remarked Sir Cresswell, nodding benevolently at Spurge when the story was over. "You're in a fair way to find yourself well rewarded. Now, gentlemen," he continued, sitting down at the table, and engaging the attention of the others, "I think we had better have a council of war. Petherton has just gone to speak to the police authorities about those warrants which have been taken out against Chatfield and the impostor, but we can go on in his absence. Now, there seems to be no doubt that those chests which Spurge tells us of contain the gold which Chatfield procured from the bank, and concerning which he seems to have played his associates more tricks than one. However, his associates, whoever they are and mind you, gentlemen, I believe there are more men than Chatfield and the Squire in all this have now got a tight grip on Chatfield, and they'll force him to show them where that gold is. They'll certainly not give up the chances of £50,000 without a stiff try to get it. So I'm considering all the possibilities and probabilities. We may conclude that sooner or later sooner, most likely somebody will visit this old peel tower that Spurge talks of. But who? For we're faced with this wireless message. I've no doubt the vessel here referred to is the Pike no doubt at all. Now, she was seen making due east, near this side of the Dogger Bank, late last night, so that it would look as if these men were making for Denmark or Germany rather than for this coast. But since receiving this message I have thought that point out. The Pike is, I believe, a very fast vessel." "Very," answered Vickers. "She can do 27 or 8 knots an hour." "Exactly," said Sir Cresswell. "Then in that case they may have put in at some northern port, landed Chatfield and 2 or 3 men to keep an eye on him and to accompany him to this old tower, while the Pike herself has gone off till a more fitting opportunity arises of dodging in somewhere to pick up the chests which Chatfield and his party will in the meantime have removed. From what I have seen of it, this is such a wild part of the coast that Chatfield and such a small gang as I'm imagining could easily come back here, keep themselves hidden, and recover the chests without observation. So our plain duty is to now devise some plan for going to the Reaver's Glen and keeping a watch there until somebody comes eh?" "There's another thing that's possible, sir," said Vickers, who had listened carefully to all that Sir Cresswell had said. "The Pike is fitted for wireless telegraphy." "Yes?" said Sir Cresswell expectantly. "And you think " "You suggested that there may be more people than Chatfield and the Squire in at this business," continued Vickers. "Just so. We Copplestone and myself know very well that the skipper of the Pike, Andrius, is in it that's undeniable. But there may be others, or one other, or two, on shore here. And as the Pike can communicate by wireless, those on board her may have sent a message to their shore confederates to remove those chests. So " "Capital suggestion!" said Sir Cresswell, who saw this point at once. "So we'd better lose no time in arranging our expedition out there. Spurge You're the man who knows the spot best. What ought we to do about getting there in force?" Spurge, obviously flattered at being called upon to advise a great man, entered into the discussion with enthusiasm. "Your honour mustn't go in force at all," he said. "What's wanted, gentlemen, is strategy. Now, if you'll let me put it to you, me knowing the lie of the land, this is what had ought to be done. A small party ought to go, with me to lead. We'll follow the road that cuts across the moorland to a certain point, then we'll take a by track that gets you to High Nick, there we'll take to a thick bit o' wood and coppice that runs right up to the peel tower. Nobody'll track us, nor see us from any point, going that way. 3 or 4 of us these here young gentlemen, now, and me, 'll be enough for the job if armed. A revolver apiece, your honour that'll be plenty. And as for the rest what you might call a reserve force your honour said something just now about some warrants. Is the police to be in at it, then?" "The police hold warrants for the 2 men we've been chiefly talking about," replied Sir Cresswell. "Well, let your honour come on a bit later with not more than 3 police plain clothes fellows, as far as High Nick," said Spurge. "The police'll know where that is. Let 'em wait there don't let 'em come further until I send back a message by my cousin Jim. You see, guv'nor," he added, turning to Copplestone, whom he seemed to regard as his own special associate, "we don't know how long things may be we might have to wait hours. As I view it me having listened careful to what his honour the Admiral there says best respects to your honour them chaps'll never come anigh that place till it's night again, or at any rate, dusk, which'll be about 7 o'clock this evening. But they may watch during the day, and it'd be a foolish thing to have a lot of men about. A small force, such as I can hide in that wood, and another in reserve at High Nick, which, guv'nor, is a deep hole in the hill top that's the ticket." "Spurge is right," said Sir Cresswell. "You youngsters go with him, get a motor car, and I'll see about following you over to High Nick with the detectives. Now, what about being armed?" "I've a supply of service revolvers at my office, down this very street," replied Vickers. "I'll go and get them. Here, let's apportion our duties. I'll see to that. Gilling, you see about the car. Copplestone, you order some breakfast for us sharp." "And I'll go round to the police," said Sir Cresswell. "Now, be careful to take care of yourselves. You don't know what you've got to deal with, remember." The group separated, and Copplestone went off to find the hotel people and order an immediate breakfast. And passing along a corridor on his way downstairs he encountered Mrs. Greyle, who came out of a room near by and stared at sight of him. "Audrey's asleep!" she whispered, pointing to the door she had just left. "Thank you for taking care of her. Of course I was afraid, but that's all over now. And now the thing is how are things?" "Coming to a head, in my opinion," answered Copplestone. "But how or in what way I don't know. Anyway, we know where that gold is, and they'll make an attempt on it that's sure. So we shall be there." "But what fools Peter Chatfield and his associates must be, from their own villainous standpoint, to have encumbered themselves with all that weight of gold!" exclaimed Mrs. Greyle. "The folly of it seems incredible, when they could have taken it in some more easily portable form." "Ha, ha!" laughed Copplestone. "But that just shows Chatfield's extraordinary deepness and craft. He no doubt persuaded his associates that it was better to have actual bullion where they were going, and tricked them into believing that he'd actually put it aboard the Pike. If it hadn't been that they examined the boxes which he put on the Pike, and found they contained lead or bricks, the old scoundrel would have collared the real stuff for himself." "Ha, ha, ha! Take care that he doesn't collar it yet," said Mrs. Greyle with a laugh as she went into her own room. "Chatfield is resourceful enough for anything. And take care of yourselves." That was the second admonition to be careful, and Copplestone thought of both, as an hour later he, Gilling, Vickers and Spurge sped along the desolate, wind swept moorland on their way to the Reaver's Glen. It was a typically northern country autumnal morning cold, raw, rainy. The tops of the neighbouring hills were capped with dark clouds; sea birds called dismally across the heather; the sea, seen in glimpses through vistas of fir and pine, looked angry and threatening. "A fit morning for a do of this sort!" exclaimed Gilling suddenly. "Is it pretty bare and bleak at this tower of yours, Spurge?" "You'll be warm enough, guv'nor, where I shall put you," answered Spurge. "One as has knocked about these woods and moors as much as I've had to, knows as many places to hide his nose in as a fox does. I'll put you by that tower where you'll be snug enough, and warm enough, too, and where nobody'll see you, neither. And here's High Nick, and out we get." Leaving the car in a deep cutting of the hills, and instructing the driver to await the return of one or other of them at a wayside farmstead a mile back, the three adventurers followed Spurge into the wood which led to the top of the Reaver's Glen. The poacher guided them onward by narrow and winding tracks through the undergrowth for a good half mile. Then he led them through thickets in which there was no paths at all. Finally, after a gradual and cautious advance behind a high hedge of dense evergreen, he halted them at a corner of the wood and motioned them to look out through a loosely laced network of branches. "Here we are!" he whispered. "Tower Reaver's Glen sea in the distance. Lone spot, ain't it, gentlemen?" Copplestone and Gilling, who had never seen this part of the coast before, looked out on the scene with lively interest. It was certainly a prospect of romance and of wild, almost savage beauty on which they gazed. Immediately in front of them, at a distance of 20 to 30 yards, stood the old peel tower, a solid square mass of grey stone, intact as to its base and its middle storeys, ruinous and crumbling from thence to what was left of its battlements and the turret tower at one angle. The fallen stone lay in irregular heaps on the ground at its foot. All around it were clumps of furze and bramble. From the level plateau on which it stood, the glen fell away in horseshoe formation, gradually narrowing and descending until it terminated in a thick covert of fir and pine that ran down to the land end of the cove of which Spurge had told them. And beyond that stretched the wide expanse of sea, with here and there a red sailed fishing boat tossing restlessly on the white capped waves, and over that and the land was a chill silence, broken only by the occasional cry of the sea birds and the bleating of the mountain sheep. "A lone spot, indeed!" said Gilling in a whisper. "Spurge, where is that stuff hidden?" "Other side of the tower, in an angle of the old courtyard," replied Spurge. "Can't see the spot from here." "And where's that road you told us about?" asked Copplestone. "The moor road?" "Top of the bank yonder, beyond the tower," said Spurge. "Runs round yonder corner of this wood, and goes right round it to High Nick, where we've cut across from. Hush now, all of you gentlemen, I'm going to signal Jim." Screwing up his mobile face into a strange contortion, Spurge emitted from his puckered lips a queer cry a cry as of some trapped animal, so shrill and realistic that his hearers started. "What on earth's that represent?" asked Gilling. "It's blood curdling!" "Hare, with a stoat's teeth in its neck," answered Spurge. "Hush! I'll call him again." No answer came to the first nor to the second summons. After a third, equally unproductive, Spurge looked at his companions with a scared face. "That's a queer thing, guv'nors," he muttered. "Can't believe as how our Jim 'ud ever desert a post. He promised me faithfully as how he'd stick here like grim death until I came back. I hope he ain't had a fit, nor aught o' that sort. He ain't a strong chap at the best o' times, and " "You'd better take a careful look round, Spurge," said Vickers. "Here, shall I come with you?" But Spurge waved a hand to them to stay where they were. He himself crept along the back of the hedge until he came to a point opposite the nearest angle of the tower. And suddenly he gave a great cry human enough this time and the three young men rushing forward found him standing by the body of a roughly clad man in whom Copplestone recognized the one eyed odd job man of the "Admiral Arms." Chapter 27 Gate of Scarhaven Keep. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 28 The Footprints. The man was lying face downwards in the grass and weeds which clustered thickly at the foot of the hedgerow, and on the line of rough, weather beaten neck which showed between his fur cap and his turned up collar there was a patch of dried blood. Very still and apparently lifeless he looked, but Vickers suddenly bent down, laid strong hands on him and turned him over. "He's not dead!" he exclaimed. "Only unconscious from a crack on his skull. Gilling, where's that brandy you brought? Hand me the flask." Zachary Spurge watched in silence as Vickers and Gilling busied themselves in reviving the stricken man. Then he quickly pulled Copplestone's sleeve and motioned him away from the group. "Guv'nor," he muttered, "there's been foul play here and all along of them 9 boxes that I'll warrant. Look you here, guv'nor, Jim's been dragged to where we found him dragged through this here gap in the hedge and flung where he's lying. See? There's the plain marks, all through the grass and stuff. Come on, guv'nor, let's see where they lead." The marks of a heavy, inanimate body having been dragged through the wet grass were evidence enough, and Copplestone and Spurge followed them to a corner of the old tower, where they ceased. Spurge glanced round that corner and uttered a sharp exclamation. "Just what I expected!" he said. "Leastways, what I expected as soon as I see Jim a lying there. Guv'nor, the stuff's gone!" He drew Copplestone after him and pointed to a corner of the weed grown courtyard where a cavity had been made in the mass of fallen masonry, and the stones, taken from it, lay about just as they had been displaced and thrown aside. "That's where the 9 boxes were," he continued. "Well, there ain't one of 'em there now not but the hole where they was. Well, this must ha' been during the early morning, after I left Jim to go into Norcaster. And of course him as put the stuff there must be him as fetched it away Chatfield. Let's see if there's footmarks about, guv'nor." "Wait a bit," said Copplestone. "We must be careful about that. Move warily we'd better do it systematically. There'd have to be some sort of a trap, a vehicle, to carry away those chests. Where's the nearest point of that road you spoke of?" "Up there," replied Spurge, pointing to a flanking bank of heather. "But they or him wasn't forced to come that way, guv'nor. He or them could have come up from that cove down yonder. It wouldn't surprise me if that there yacht the Pike, you know had turned on her tracks and come in here during the night. It's not more than a mile from this tower down to the shore, and " At that moment Vickers called to them, and they went back to find Jim Spurge slowly opening his eyes and looking round him with consciousness of his company. His one eye lightened a little as he caught sight of Zachary, and the poacher bent down to him. "Jim, old man," he said soothingly. "How are you, Jim? You been hit by somebody? Who was it, Jim?" "Give him a drop more brandy and lift him up a bit," counselled Gilling. "He's improving." But it needed more than a mere drop of brandy, more than cousinly words of adjuration, to bring the wounded man back to a state of speech. And when at last he managed to make a feeble response, it was only to mutter some incoherent and disjointed sentences about being struck down from behind, after which he again relapsed into semi unconsciousness. "That's it, guv'nor!" muttered Spurge, nudging Copplestone. "That's the ticket struck down from behind that's what happened to him. Unawares, so to speak, I can reckon of it up. Easy. They comes in the darkness, after I'd left him here. He hears of 'em, as he says, a moving about. Then he no doubt starts moving about, watching 'em, as far as he can see. Then one of 'em gives him this crack on the skull life preserver, if you ask me and down he goes. And then they drag him in here and leaves him. Don't care whether he's a goner or not not they. Well, and what does it prove? That there's been more than one of 'em, guv'nor, and in my opinion, where they've come from is down there." He pointed down the glen in the direction of the sea, and the 3 young men who were considerably exercised by this sudden turn of events and the disappearance of the chests, looked after his outstretched hand and then at each other. "Well, we can't stand here doing nothing," said Gilling at last. "Look here, we'd better divide forces. This chap'll have to be removed and got to some hospital. Vickers, I guess you're the quickest footed of the lot will you run back to High Nick and tell that chauffeur to bring his car round here? If Sir Cresswell and the police are there, tell them what's happened. Spurge, you go down the glen there and see if you can see anything of any suspicious looking craft in that bay you told us of. Copplestone, we can't do any more for this man just now. Let's look round. This is a queer business," he went on, when they had all departed, and he and Copplestone were walking towards the tower. "The gold's gone, of course." "No sign of it here, anyway," answered Copplestone, leading him into the ruinous courtyard and pointing to the cavity in the fallen masonry. "That's where it was placed by Chatfield, according to Zachary Spurge." "And of course Chatfield's removed it during the night," remarked Gilling. "That message which Sir Cresswell read us must have been all wrong. The Pike's come south, and she's been somewhere about maybe been in that cove at the end of the glen, though she'll have cleared out of it hours ago," he concluded disappointedly. "We're too late." "That theory's not necessarily correct," replied Copplestone. "Sir Cresswell's message may have been quite right. For all we know, the folks on the Pike had confederates on shore. Go carefully, Gilling let's see if we can make out anything in the way of footprints." The ground in the courtyard was grassless, a flooring of grit and loose stone, on which no impression could be well made by human foot. But Copplestone, carefully prospecting around and going a little way up the bank which lay between the tower and the moorland road, suddenly saw something in the black, peat like earth which attracted his attention, and he called to his companion. "I say!" he exclaimed. "Look at this! There! That's unmistakable enough. And fresh, too." Gilling bent down, looked, and stared at Copplestone with a question in his eyes. "By Gad!" he said. "A woman!" "And one who wears good and shapely footwear, too," remarked Copplestone. "That's what you'd call a slender and elegant foot. Here it is again going up the bank. Come on." There were more traces of this wearer of elegant footgear on the soft earth of the bank which ran between the moorland and the stone strewn courtyard, more again on the edges of the road itself. There, too, were plain signs that a motor car of some sort had recently been pulled up opposite the tower. Gilling pointed to the indentations made by the studded wheels, and to droppings of oil and petrol on the gravelly soil. "That's evident enough," he said. "Those chests have been fetched away during the night by motor, and a woman's been in at it. Confederates, of course. Now then, the next thing is which way did that motor go with its contents?" They followed the tracks for a short distance along the road, until coming to a place where it widened at a gateway leading into the wood, they saw that the car had there been backed and turned. Gilling carefully examined the marks. "That car came from Norcaster, and it's gone back to Norcaster," he affirmed presently. "Look here they came up the hill at the side of the wood. Here they backed the car towards that gate, and then ran it backwards till they were abreast of the tower. Then, when they'd loaded up with those chests, they went straight off by the way they'd come. Look at the tracks plain enough." "Then we'd better get down towards Norcaster ourselves," said Copplestone. "Call Spurge back he'll find nothing in that cove. This job has been done from land. And we ought to be on the track of these people they've had several hours' start already." By this time Zachary Spurge had been recalled, Vickers had brought the car round from High Nick, and the injured man was carefully lifted into it and driven away. But at High Nick itself they met another car, hurrying up from Norcaster, and bringing Sir Cresswell Oliver and 3 other men who bore the unmistakable stamp of the police force. In one of them Copplestone recognized the inspector from Scarhaven. The 2 cars met and stopped alongside each other, and Sir Cresswell, with one sharp glance at the rough bandage which Vickers had fastened round Jim Spurge's head, rapped out a question. "Gone," replied Gilling with equal brusqueness. "Came in a motor, during the night, soon after Zachary Spurge left Jim. They hit him pretty hard over his head and left him unconscious. Of course, they've carried off the boxes. Car appears to have gone to Norcaster. Hadn't you better turn?" Sir Cresswell pointed to the Scarhaven police inspector. "Here's news from Scarhaven," he said, bending forward to the other car. "The inspector's just brought it. The Squire whoever he was is dead. They found his body this morning, lying at the foot of a cliff near the Keep. Foul play? That's what you don't know, eh, Inspector?" "Can't say at all, sir," answered the inspector. "He might have been thrown down he might have fallen down. It's a bad place. Anyway, what the doctor said, just before I hurried in here to tell Mrs. Greyle, as the next relative that we know of, is that he'd been dead some days. The body, you see, was lying in a thicket at the foot of the cliff." "Some days!" exclaimed Copplestone, with a look at Gilling. "Days?" "4 or 5 days, at least, sir," replied the inspector. "So the doctor thinks. The place is a cliff between the high road from Northborough and the house itself. There's a short cut across the park to the house from that road. It looks as if " "Ah!" interrupted Gilling. "It's clear how that happened, then. He took that short cut when he came from Northborough that night. But if he's dead, who's engineering all this? There's the fact those chests of gold have been removed from that old tower since Zachary Spurge left his cousin in charge there early this morning. Everything looks as if they'd been carried to Norcaster. Therefore " "Turn this car round," commanded Sir Cresswell. "Of course, we must get back to Norcaster but what's to be done there?" The two cars went scurrying back to the old shipping town. When at last they had deposited the injured man at a neighbouring hospital and came to a stop near the "Angel," Zachary Spurge pulled Copplestone's sleeve, and with a look of significance motioned him aside to a quiet place. CHAPTER XXIX. 29 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. CHAPTER XXIX. Scarvell's Cut. The quiet place was a narrow alley, which, opening out of the market square in which the car had come to a halt, suddenly twisted away into a labyrinth of ancient buildings that lay between the centre of the town and the river. Not until Spurge had conducted Copplestone quite away from their late companions did he turn and speak. When he spoke, his words were accompanied by a glance which suggested mystery as well as confidence. "Guv'nor," he said, "what's going to be done?" "Have you pulled me down here to ask that?" exclaimed Copplestone, a little impatiently. "Good heavens, man, with all these complications arising the gold gone, the Squire dead why, there'll have to be a pretty deep consultation, of course. We'd better get back to it." But Spurge shook his head. "Not me, guv'nor," he said resolutely. "I ain't no opinion o' consultations with lawyers and policemen, plain clothes or otherwise. They ain't no mortal good whatever, guv'nor, when it comes to horse sense. 'Cause why? 'Tain't their fault it's the system. They can't do nothing, start nothing, suggest nothing. They can only do things in the official, cut and dried, red tape way, guv'nor. You and me can do better." "Well?" asked Copplestone. "Listen," continued Spurge. "There ain't no doubt that that gold was carried off early this morning must have been between the time I left Jim and sun up, 'cause they'd want to do the job in darkness. Ain't no reasonable doubt, neither, that the motor car what they used came here into Norcaster. Now, guv'nor, I ask you, where is it possible they'd make for? Not a railway station, 'cause them boxes 'ud be conspicuous and easy traced when inquiry was made, and yet they'd want to get 'em away, as soon as possible. Very well what's the other way o' getting any stuff out o' Norcaster? What? Why, that!" He jerked his thumb in the direction of a patch of grey water which shone dully at the end of the alley, and while his thumb jerked, his eye winked. "The river!" he went on. "The river, guv'nor! Don't this here river, running into the free and bounding ocean 6 miles away, offer the best chance? What we want to do is to take a look round these here docks and quays and wharves keeping our eyes open, and our ears as well. Come on with me, guv'nor I know places all along this riverside where you could hide the Bank of England till it was wanted, so to speak." "But the others?" suggested Copplestone. "Hadn't we better fetch them?" "No!" retorted Spurge assertively. "Two of us is enough. You trust to me, guv'nor I'll find out something. I know these docks, and all that's alongside 'em. I'd do the job myself, now. but it'd be better to have somebody along of me, in case we want a message sending for help or anything of that nature. Come on and if I don't find out before noon if there's any queer craft gone out of this place since morning, why, then, I ain't what I believe myself to be." Copplestone, who had considerable faith in the poacher's shrewdness, allowed himself to be led into the lowest part of the town, low in more than one sense of the word. Norcaster itself, as regards its ancient and time hallowed portions, its church, its castle, its official buildings and highly respectable houses, stood on the top of a low hill, its docks and wharves and the mean streets which intersected them had been made on a stretch of marshland that lay between the foot of that hill and the river. And down there was the smell of tar and of merchandise, and narrow alleys full of sea going men and raucous voiced women, and queer nooks and corners, and ships being laden and ships being stripped of their cargoes, and such noise and confusion and inextricable mingling and elbowing that Copplestone thought it was as likely to find a needle in a haystack as to make anything out of relating to the quest they were engaged in. But Zachary Spurge, leading him in and out of the throngs on the wharves, now taking a look into a dock, now inspecting a quay, now stopping to exchange a word or two with taciturn gentlemen who sucked their pipes at the corners of narrow streets, now going into shady looking public houses by one door and coming out at another, seemed to be remarkably well satisfied with his doings, and kept remarking to his companion that they would hear something yet. Nevertheless, by noon they had heard nothing, and Copplestone, who considered casual search of this sort utterly purposeless, announced that he was going to more savoury neighbourhoods. "Give it another turn, guv'nor," urged Spurge. "Have a bit of faith in me now. You see, guv'nor, I've an idea, a theory, as you might term it, of my very own, only time's too short to go into details, like. Trust me a bit longer, guv'nor there's a spot or two down here that I'm fair keen on taking a look at. Come on, guv'nor once more. This is Scarvell's Cut." He drew his unwilling companion round a corner of the wharf which they were just then patrolling, and showed him a narrow creek which, hemmed in by ancient buildings, some of them half ruinous, sail lofts, and sheds full of odds and ends of merchandise, cut into the land at an irregular angle, and was at that moment affording harbourage to a mass of small vessels just then lying high and dry on the banks from which the tide had retreated. Along the side of this creek there was just as much crowding and confusion as on the wider quays. Men were going in and out of the sheds and lofts. Men were busy about the sides of the small craft. And again the feeling of uselessness came over Copplestone. "What's the good of all this, Spurge?" he exclaimed testily. "You'll never " Spurge suddenly laid a grip on his companion's elbow and twisted him aside into a narrow entry between the sheds. "That's the good!" he answered in an exulting voice. "Look there, guv'nor look at that North Sea tug that one, lying out there. Whose face is now a peeping out of that hatch? Come, now." Copplestone looked in the direction which Spurge indicated. There, lying moored to the wharf, at a point exactly opposite a tumble down sail loft, was one of those strongly built tugs which ply between the fishing fleets and the ports. It was an eminently business looking craft, rakish for its class, and it bore marks of much recent sea usage. But Copplestone gave no more than a passing glance at it. What attracted and fascinated his eyes was the face of a man who had come up from her depths and was looking out of a hatchway on the top deck, looking expectantly at the sail loft. There was grime and oil on that face, and the neck which supported the unkempt head rose out of a rough jersey, but Copplestone recognized his man smartly enough. In spite of the attempt to look like a tug deck hand, there was no mistaking the skipper of the Pike. "Good heavens!" he muttered as he stared across the crowded quay. "Andrius!" "Right you are, guv'nor!" whispered Spurge. "It's that very same, and no mistake. And now you'll perhaps see how I put things together, like. No doubt those folk as sent Sir Cresswell that message did see the Pike going east last evening. Just so but there wasn't no reason, considering what that chap and his lot had at stake, Why, they shouldn't put him, and one or two more, very likely, on one of the many tugs that's to be met with out there off the fishing grounds. What I conclude they did, guv'nor, was to charter one of them tugs and run her in here. And I expect they've got the stuff on board her now, and when the tide comes up, out they'll go, and be off into the free and open again, to pick the Pike up somewhere 'twixt here and the Dogger Bank. Ah, smart 'uns they are, no doubt but we've got 'em!" "Not yet," said Copplestone. "What are we to do? Better go back and get help, eh?" He was keenly watching Andrius, and as the skipper of the Pike suddenly moved, he drew Spurge further into the alley. "He's coming out of that hatchway!" whispered Copplestone. "If he comes ashore he'll see us, and then " "No matter, guv'nor," said Spurge reassuringly. "They can't get out o' Scarvell's Cut into the river till the tide serves. Yes, that's Cap'n Andrius right enough and he's coming ashore." Andrius had by that time drawn himself out of the hatchway, and now revealed himself in the jersey, the thick leg wear and short sea boots of an ocean going man. Copplestone's recollection of him as he showed himself on board the Pike was of a very smartly attired, rather dandified person only some deep scheme, he knew, would have caused him to assume this disguise, and he watched him with interest as he rolled ashore and disappeared within the lower story of the sail loft. Spurge, too, watched with all his eyes, and he turned to Copplestone with a gleam of excitement. "Guv'nor," he said, "we've trapped 'em beautiful! I know that place I've worked in there in my time. I know a way into it from the back we'll get in that way, and see what's being done. 'Tain't worked no longer, that sail loft it's all falling to pieces. But first help!" "How are we to get that?" asked Copplestone eagerly. "I'll go it," replied Spurge. "I know a man just aback of here that'll run up to the town with a message chap that can be trusted, sure and faithful. Bide here 5 minutes, sir I'll send a message to Mr. Vickers. This chap'll know him and'll find him. He can come down with the rest, and the police, too, if he likes. Keep your eyes skinned, guv'nor." He twisted away like an eel into the crowd of workers and idlers, and left Copplestone at the entrance to an alley, watching. And he had not been so left more than a couple of minutes when a woman slipped past the mouth of the alley, swiftly, quietly, looking neither to right nor left, of whose veiled head and face he caught one glance, and in that glance he recognized her Addie Chatfield. But in the moment of that glance Copplestone also recognized something vastly more important. Here was the explanation of the mystery of the early morning doings at the old tower. The footprints of a woman who wore fashionable and elegant boots? Addie Chatfield, of course. Was she not old Peter's daughter, a chip of the old block, even though a feminine chip? And did not he and Gilling know that she had been mixed up with Peter at the Bristol affair? Great Scott! Why, of course! Addie was an accomplice in all these things. If Copplestone had the least shadow of doubt remaining in his mind as to this conclusion, it was utterly dissipated when, peering cautiously round the corner of his hiding place, he saw Addie disappear within the old sail loft into which Andrius had betaken himself. Of course she had gone to join her fellow conspirators. He began to fume and fret, cursing himself for allowing Spurge to bring him down there alone. If only they had had Gilling and Vickers with them, armed as they were! "All right, guv'nor!" Spurge suddenly whispered at his shoulder. "They'll be here in a quarter of an hour. I telephoned to 'em." "Do you know what?" exclaimed Copplestone excitedly. "Old Chatfield's daughter's gone in there, where Andrius went just now." "What, the play actress?" said Spurge. "You don't say, guv'nor! Ha! That explains everything that's the missing link. Ha! But we'll know soon what they're after, Mr. Copplestone. Follow me quiet as a mouse." Once more submitting to be led, Copplestone followed his queer guide along the alley. XXX. Of Scarhaven Keep. Recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. CHAPTER XXX. The greengrocer's cart. Spurge led Copplestone a little way up the narrow alley from the mouth of which they had observed the recent proceedings, suddenly turned off into a still narrower passage, and emerged at the rear of an ancient building of wood and stones which looked as if a stout shove or a strong wind would bring it down in dust and ruin. "Back of that old sail loft what looks out on this cut," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder at Copplestone. "Now, guv'nor, we're going in here. As I said before, I've worked in this place did a spell here when I was once lying low for a month or two. I know every inch of it, and if that lot are under this roof, I know where they'll be." "They'll show fight, you know," remarked Copplestone. "Well, but ain't we got something to show fight with, too?" answered Spurge with a knowing wink. "I've got my revolver handy, what Mr. Vickers give me, and I reckon you can handle yours. However, it ain't come to no revolver yet. What I want to see and hear, guv'nor follow me." He had opened a ramshackle door in the rear of the premises as he spoke, and he now beckoned his companion to follow him down a passage which evidently led to the front. There was no more than a dim light within, but Copplestone could see that the whole place was falling to pieces. And it was all wrapped in a dead silence. Away out on the quay was the rattle of chains, the creaking of a windlass, the voices of men and shrill laughter of women, but in there no sound existed. And Spurge suddenly stopped his stealthy creeping forward and looked at Copplestone suspiciously. "Queer, ain't it?" he whispered. "I don't hear a voice, nor yet the ghost of one. You'd think that if they was in here they'd be talking. But we'll soon see." Clambering up a pile of fallen timber which lay in the passage, and beckoning Copplestone to follow his example, Spurge looked through a broken slat in the wooden partition into an open shed which fronted the cut. The shed was empty. Folk were passing to and fro in front of it. The North Sea tug still lay at the wharf beyond. A man who was evidently its skipper sat on a tub on its deck placidly smoking his short pipe. But of Addy Chatfield or of Andrius there was no sign, and the silence in that crumbling, rat haunted house was deeper than ever. "Guv'nor!" muttered Spurge. "How long is it since you see her?" "Almost as soon as you'd gone," answered Copplestone. "10 minutes ago," sighed Spurge. "Guv'nor, they've done us they're off! I see it she must ha' caught sight of me, nose and round, and she came here and gave the others the office, and they bucked out at the back. The back, guv'nor! And Lord bless you, at the back of this shanty there's a perfect rabbit warren o' places more by token, they call it the Warren. If they've got in there, why, all the police in Norcaster'll never find 'em leastways, I mean, to speak truthful, not without a deal o' trouble." "What about upstairs?" asked Copplestone. "Upstairs, now?" said Spurge with a doubtful glance at the ramshackle stairway. "Lord, mister, I don't believe nobody could get up them stairs. No, they've hooked it through the back here, into the Warren, and once in there " He ended with an eloquent gesture, and dismounting from his perch, made his way along the passage to a door which opened into the shed. Thence he looked out on the quay, and along the crowded maze of Scarvell's Cut. "Here's some of 'em, anyway, guv'nor," he announced. "I see Mr. Vickers and t'other London gentleman, and the old Admiral, at all events. There they are, getting out of a motor at the end. But go to meet 'em, Mr. Copplestone, while I keep my eye on this here tug and its skipper." Copplestone elbowed his way through the crowd until he met Sir Cresswell and his two companions. All three were eager and excited. Copplestone could only respond to their inquiries with a gloomy shake of the head. "We seem to have the devil's own luck!" he growled dismally. "Spurge and I spotted Andrius by sheer accident. He was on a North Sea tug, or trawler, along the quay here. Then Spurge ran off to summon you. While he was away Miss Chatfield appeared." "Addy Chatfield!" exclaimed Vickers. "Exactly! And that, of course," continued Copplestone, glancing at Gilling, "that without doubt in my opinion, anyway explains those elegant footprints up at the tower. Addy Chatfield, I tell you! She passed me as I was hiding at the entrance to an alley down the cut here, and she went into an old sail loft, outside which the tug I spoke of is moored, and into which Andrius had strolled a minute or two previously. But neither she nor Andrius are there now they've gone, and Spurge says that at the back of this quay there's a perfect rabbit warren of courts and alleys, and if or rather as they've escaped into that, eh?" The detectives who had accompanied Sir Cresswell on the interrupted expedition to the old tower, and who had now followed him and his companions in a second car and arrived in time to hear Copplestone's story, looked at each other. "That's right enough, comparatively speaking," said one. "But if they're in the Warren we shall get 'em out. The first thing to do, gentlemen, is to take a look at that tug." "Exactly!" exclaimed Sir Cresswell. "Just what I was thinking. Let us find out what its people have to say." The man who smoked his pipe in placid contentment on the deck of the tug looked up in astonishment as the posse of 8 crossed the plank which connected him with the quay. Nevertheless he preserved an undaunted front, kept his pipe in his tightly closed lips, and cocked a defiant eye at everybody. "Skipper of this craft?" asked the principal detective laconically. "Right? Where are you from, then, and when did you come in here?" The skipper removed his pipe and spat over the rail. He put the pipe back, folded his arms and glared. "And what the dickens may that be to do with you?" he inquired. "And who may you be to walk aboard my vessel without leave?" "None of that, now!" said the detective. "Come on, we're police officers. There's something wrong round here. We've got warrants for 2 men that we believe to have been on your tug. One of 'em was seen here not so many minutes ago. You'd far better tell us what you know. If you don't tell now, you'll have to tell later. And I expect you've been paid already. Come on out with it." The skipper, whose gnarled countenance had undergone several changes during this address, smote one red fist on top of the other. "Darned if I don't know as there was something on the crook in this here affair!" he said almost cheerily. "Well, well but I ain't got nothing to do with it. Warrants, you say? Ah and what might be the particular nature of them warrants?" "Murder," answered the detective. "That's one charge, anyhow for one of 'em, at any rate. There's others." "Murder's enough," responded the skipper. "Well, of course, nobody can tell a man to be a murderer by merely looking at his mug. Not at all nobody. However, this here is how it is. Last night it were evening, to be correct dark. I was on the edge of the Fleet out there off the Dogger. A yacht comes up smart 'un very fast sailer and hails me. Was I going into Norcaster or anywheres about? Being a Northborough tug, this, I wasn't. Would I go for a consideration, then and there? Whereupon I asked what consideration. Then we bargains. Eventual, we struck it at £30, cash down, which was paid prompt. I was to take 2 men straight and slick into Norcaster to this here very slip, Scarvell's Cut, to wait while they put a bit of a cargo on board, and then to run 'em back to the same spot where I took 'em up. Done! They come aboard, the yacht goes off east, I come careening west. That's all that part of it, anyway." "And the men?" suggested the detective. "What sort were they, and where are they?" "The men, now," said the skipper. "Ah! 2 of 'em, both done up in what you might call deep sea style, but hadn't never done no deep sea nor yet any other sort of sea work in their mortal days. Hands as white and soft as a lady's. One, an old chap, with a dial like a full moon on him sly old chap, him. T'other a younger man looked as if he'd something about him dangerous chap to cross. Where are they? Darned if I know. What I know's certain is this. We gets in here about 8 o'clock this morning, and makes fast here, and ever since then them two's been, as it were, on the fret and the fidge, allers looking out, so to speak, for some un as ain't come yet. The old chap, he went across into that there sailmaker's loft an hour ago, and t'other, he followed of him recent. I ain't seen him since. Try there." "And I say " "Well?" asked the detective. "Shall I be wanted?" asked the skipper. "'Cause if I'm not, I'm off and away as soon as the tide serves. Ain't no good me waiting here for them chaps if you're going to take and hang 'em." "Got to catch 'em first," said the detective, with a glance at his 2 professional companions. "And while we're not doubting your word at all, We'll just take a look round your vessel they might have slipped on board again, you see, while your back was turned." But there was no sign of Peter Chatfield, nor of his daughter, nor of the captain of the Pike on that tug, nor anywhere in the sailmaker's loft and its purlieus. And presently the detectives looked at one another, and their leader turned to Sir Cresswell. "If these people, as seems certain, have escaped into this quarter of the town," he said, "there'll have to be a regular hunt for them. I've known a man who was badly wanted stow himself away here for weeks. If Chatfield has accomplices down here in the Warren, he can hide himself and whoever's with him for a long time successfully. We'll have to get a lot of men to work." "But I say!" exclaimed Gilling. "You don't mean to tell me that three people, one a woman, could get away through these courts and alleys, packed as they are, without being seen? Come, now!" The detectives smiled indulgently. "You don't know these folks," said one of them, inclining his head towards a squalid street at the end of which they had all gathered. "But they know us. It's a point of honour with them never to tell the truth to a policeman or detective. If they saw those three, they'd never admit it to us until it's made worth their while." "Get it made worth their while, then!" exclaimed Gilling, impatiently. "All in due course, sir," said the official voice. "Leave it to us." The amateur searchers after the iniquitous recognized the futility of their own endeavours in that moment and went away to discuss matters amongst themselves, while the detectives proceeded leisurely, after their fashion, into the Warren as if they were out for a quiet constitutional in its salubrious byways. And Sir Cresswell Oliver remarked on the difficulty of knowing exactly what to do once you had red tape on one side and unofficial craftiness on the other. "You think there's no doubt that gold was removed this morning by Chatfield's daughter?" he said to Copplestone as they went back to the centre of the town together, Gilling and Vickers having turned aside elsewhere and Spurge gone to the hospital to ask for news of his cousin. "You think she was the woman whose footprints you saw up there at the Reaver's Glen?" "Seeing that she's here in Norcaster and in touch with those two, what else can I think?" replied Copplestone. "It seems to me that they got in touch with her by wireless, and that she removed the gold in readiness for her father and Andrius coming in here by that North Sea tug. If we could only find out where she's put those boxes, or where she got the car from in which she brought it down from the tower!" "Vickers has already started some inquiries about cars," said Sir Cresswell. "She must have hired a car somewhere in the town. Certainly, if we could hear of that gold we should be in the way of getting on their track." But they heard nothing of gold or of fugitives, or of what the police and detectives were doing until the middle of the afternoon. And then Mr. Elkin, the manager of the bank from which Chatfield had withdrawn the estate and the private balance, came hurrying to the "Angel" and to Mrs. Greyle, his usually rubicund face pale with emotion, his hand waving a scrap of crumpled paper. Mrs. Greyle and Audrey were at that moment in consultation with Sir Cresswell Oliver and Copplestone. The bank manager burst in on them without ceremony. "I say! He exclaimed excitedly. "Will you believe it? The gold's come back! It's all safe every penny! Bless me! I scarcely know whether I'm dreaming or not. But we've got it!" "What's all this?" demanded Sir Cresswell. "You've got that gold?" "Less than an hour ago," replied the bank manager, dropping into a chair and slapping his hand on his knees in his excitement. "A man who turned out to be a greengrocer came with his cart to the bank and said he'd been sent with 9 boxes for delivery to us. Asked who had sent him, he replied that early this morning a lady whom he didn't know had asked him to put the boxes in his shed until she called for them. She brought them in a motor car. This afternoon she called again at 2 o'clock, paid him for the storage and for what he was to do, and instructed him to put the boxes on his cart and bring them to us. Which," continued Mr. Elkin, gleefully rubbing his hands together, "he did! With this! And that, my dear ladies and good gentlemen, is the most extraordinary document which, in all my 40 years' experience of banking matters, I have ever seen." He laid a dirty, crumpled half sheet of cheap note paper on the table at which they were all sitting, and Copplestone, bending over it, read aloud what was there written. "Mr. Elkin, Please place the contents of the 9 cases sent herewith to the credit of the Greyle estate. Peter Chatfield, Agent. Amidst a chorus of exclamations Sir Cresswell asked a sharp question. "Is that really Chatfield's signature?" "Oh, undoubtedly!" replied Mr. Elkin. "Not a doubt of it. Of course, as soon as I saw it, I closely questioned the greengrocer. But he knew nothing. He said the lady was what he called wrapped up about her face veiled, of course on both her visits, and that as soon as she'd seen him set off with his load of boxes, she disappeared. He lives, this greengrocer, on the edge of the town I've got his address. But I'm sure he knows no more." "And the cases have been examined?" asked Copplestone. "Every one, my dear sir," answered the bank manager with a satisfied smirk. "Every penny is there. Glorious!" "This is most extraordinary!" said Sir Cresswell. "What on earth does it all mean? If we could only trace that woman from the greengrocer's place!" But nothing came of an attempt to carry out this proposal, and no news arrived from the police, and the evening had grown far advanced, and Mrs. Greyle and Audrey, with Sir Cresswell, Mr. Petherton and Vickers, Copplestone and Gilling, were all in a private parlour together at a late hour, when the door suddenly opened and a woman entered, who threw back a heavy veil and revealed herself as Addie Chatfield. Chapter 31 of Scarhaven Keep. This recording is in the public domain. Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Chapter 31 Ambassadress Extraordinary. If Copplestone had never seen Addie Chatfield before, if he had not known that she was an actress of some acknowledged ability, her entrance into that suddenly silent room would have convinced him that here was a woman whom nature had undoubtedly gifted with the dramatic instinct. Addie's presentation of herself to the small and select audience was eminently dramatic, without being theatrical. She filled the stage. It was as if the lights had suddenly gone down in the auditorium and up in the proscenium, as if a hush fell, as if every ear opened wide to catch a first accent. And Addie's first accents were soft and liquid, and accompanied by a smile which was calculated to soften the 7 hearts which had begun to beat a little quicker at her coming. With the smile and the soft accent came a highly successful attempt at a shy and modest blush which mounted to her cheek as she moved towards the centre table and bowed to the startled and inquisitive eyes. "I have come to ask mercy." There was a faint sigh of surprise from somebody. Sir Cresswell Oliver, only realizing that a pretty woman had entered the room, had made haste to place a chair for her. But before Addie could respond to his old fashioned bow, Mr. Petherton was on his legs. I take it that this is the young the Miss Chatfield of whom we have had occasion to speak a good deal today," he said very stiffly. "I think, Sir Cresswell eh?" "Yes," said Sir Cresswell, glancing from the visitor to the old lawyer. "You think, Petherton yes?" "The situation is decidedly unpleasant," said Mr. Petherton, more icily than ever. "Mr. Vickers will agree with me that it is most unpleasant and very unusual. The fact is, the police are now searching for this young lady." "But I am here!" exclaimed Addie. "Doesn't that show that I'm not afraid of the police? I came of my own free will to explain and to ask you all to be merciful." "To whom?" demanded Mr. Petherton. "Well to my father, if you want to know," replied Addie, with another softening glance. "Come now, all of you, what's the good of being so down on an old man who, after all, hasn't got so very long to live? There are 2 of you here who are getting on, you know. It doesn't become old men to be so hard. Good doctrine that, anyway isn't it, Sir Cresswell?" Sir Cresswell turned away, obviously disconcerted. When he looked round again, he avoided the eyes of the young men, and glanced a little sheepishly at Mr. Petherton. "It seems to me, Petherton," he said, "that we ought to hear what Miss Chatfield has to say. Evidently she comes to tell us of her own free will something. I should like to know what that something is. I think Mrs. Greyle would like to know, too." "Decidedly!" exclaimed Mrs. Greyle, who was watching the central figure with great curiosity. "I should indeed like to know especially if Miss Chatfield proposes to tell us something about her father." Mr. Petherton, who frowned very much and appeared to be greatly disturbed by these irregularities, twisted sharply round on the visitor. "Where is your father?" he demanded. "Where you can't find him," retorted Addie, with a flash of the eye that lit up her whole face. "So's Andrius. They're off, my good sir, both of 'em. Neither you nor the police can lay hands on 'em now and you'll do no good by laying hands on me. Come, now," she went on, "I said I'd come to ask for mercy, but I came for more. This game's all over. It's up. The curtain's down at least it's going down. Why don't you let me tell you all about it and then we can be friends?" Mr. Petherton gazed at Addie for a moment as if she were some extraordinary specimen of a new race. Then he took off his glasses, waved them at Sir Cresswell and dropped into a chair with a snort. "I wash my hands of the whole thing!" he exclaimed. "Do what you like, all of you. Irregular most irregular!" Vickers gave Addie a sly look. "Don't incriminate yourself, Miss Chatfield," he said. "There's no need for you to tell anything against yourself, you know." "Me?" exclaimed Addie. "Why, I've been playing good angel all day long! Me incriminate myself, indeed! If Miss Greyle there only knew what I'd done for her Look here," she continued, suddenly turning to Sir Cresswell, "I've come to tell all about it, and first of all, every penny of that money that my father drew from the bank has been restored this afternoon." "We know that," said Sir Cresswell. "Well, that was me I engineered that," continued Addie. "And second, the Pike will be back at Scarhaven during the night, to unload everything that was being carried away. My doing again because I'm no fool, and I know when a game's up." "So there was a game?" suggested Vickers. Addie leaned forward from the chair which Sir Cresswell had given her at the end of the table, and planting her elbows on the table edge, began to check off her points on the tips of her slender fingers. She was well aware that she had the stage to herself by that time, and she showed her consciousness of it. "You have it," she answered. "There was a game, and perhaps I know more of it than anybody. I'll tell now. It began at Bristol I was playing there. One morning my father fetched me out from rehearsal to tell me that he'd been down to Falmouth to meet the new Squire of Scarhaven, Marston Greyle, and that he found him so ill that they'd had to go to a doctor, who forbade Greyle to travel far at a time. They'd got to Bristol. There Greyle was so much worse that my father didn't know what to do with him. He knew that I was in the town, so he came to me. I got Greyle a quiet room at my lodgings. A doctor saw him. He said he was very bad, but he didn't say that he was in immediate danger. However, he died that very night." Addie paused for a moment, and Copplestone and Gilling exchanged glances. So far, this was all known to them. But what was coming? "Now, I was alone with Greyle for a while that evening," continued Addie. "It was while my father was getting some food downstairs. Greyle said to me that he knew he was dying, and he gave me a pocket book in which he said all his papers were. He said I could give it to my father. I believe he became unconscious soon after that. Anyway, he never mentioned that pocket book to my father neither did I. But after Greyle was dead I examined its contents carefully, and when I was in London at the end of the week I showed them to my husband." Addie again paused, and at least two of the men glanced at each other with a look of surmise. Her husband! "Who the fact is," she went on suddenly, "Captain Andrius is my husband. But nobody knew that not even my own father. We've been married 3 years. I met him when I was crossing over to America once. We got married. We kept the marriage secret for reasons of our own. Well, he met me in London the Sunday after Greyle's death, and I showed him the papers which were in Greyle's pocket book. And now this, of course, was where it was very wicked in me and him though we've tried to make up for it today, anyhow. We fixed up what I suppose you two gentlemen would call a conspiracy. My husband had a brother, an actor not up to much, nor of much experience who had been brought up in the States and who was then in town, doing nothing. We took him into confidence, coached him up in everything, furnished him with all the papers in the pocket book, and resolved to pass him off as the real Marston Greyle." Mr. Petherton stirred angrily in his chair, and turned a protesting face on Sir Cresswell. "Apart from being irregular," he exclaimed, "this is altogether outrageous! This woman is openly boasting of conspiracy and " "You're wrong!" said Addie. "I'm not boasting I'm explaining. You ought to be obliged to me. And if Mrs. Andrius to give the lady her real name cares to unburden her secrets to us, I really don't see why we shouldn't listen to them, Mr. Petherton," observed Vickers. "It simplifies matters greatly." "That's what I say," agreed Addie. "I'm done with all this, and I want to clear things up, whatever comes of it. Well, I say we fix that up with my brother in law." "His real name, if you please?" inquired Vickers. "Oh well, his real name was Martin Andrius, but he'd another name for the stage," replied Addie. "We gave him the papers and arranged for him to go down to Scarhaven to my father. Now I want to assure you all, right here, that my father never did really know that Martin was an impostor. He began to suspect something at the end, but he didn't know for a fact. Martin went down to him at Scarhaven, just a week after the real Marston Greyle had died. He claimed to be Marston Greyle he produced his papers. My father told about the Marston Greyle he'd buried. Martin pooh poohed that. He said that man must be a secretary of his, Mark Grey, who, after stealing some documents, had left him in New York and slipped across here, no doubt meaning to pass himself off as the real man until he could get something substantial out of the estate, when he'd have vanished. I tell you my father accepted that story. Why? Because he knew that if Miss Greyle there came into the estate, she and her mother would have bundled Peter Chatfield out of his stewardship quick." "Proceed, if you please," said Sir Cresswell. "There are other details about which I am anxious to hear." "Meaning about your own brother," remarked Addie. "I'm coming to that. Well, on his story and on his production of those papers birth certificates, Greyle papers of their life in America, and so on everybody accepted Martin as the real man, and things seemed to go on smoothly till that Sunday when Bassett Oliver had the bad luck to go to Scarhaven. And now, Sir Cresswell, I'll tell you the plain and absolute truth about your brother's death. It's the absolute truth, mind nobody knows it better than I do. On that Sunday I was at Scarhaven. I wanted to speak privately to Martin. I arranged to meet him in the grounds of the Keep during the afternoon. I did meet him there. We hadn't been talking many minutes when Bassett Oliver came in through the door in the wall, which one of us had carelessly left open. He didn't see us, but we saw him. And we were afraid. Why? Because Bassett Oliver knew both of us. He'd met Martin several times, in London and in New York. And of course he knew that Martin was no more Marston Greyle than he himself was. Well, we both shrank behind some shrubs that we were standing amongst, and we gave each other one look, and Martin went white as death. But Bassett Oliver went on across the lawn, never seeing us, and he entered the turret tower and went up. Martin just said to me, 'If Bassett Oliver sees me, there's an end to all this. What's to be done?' But before I could speak or think, we saw Bassett at the top of the tower, making his way round the inside parapet. And suddenly he disappeared." Addie's voice had become low and grave during the last few minutes, and she kept her eyes on the table at the end. But she looked up readily enough when Sir Cresswell seized her arm and rapped out a question almost in her ear. "Is that the truth the real truth?" "It's the absolute truth," she answered, regarding him steadily. "I'm not altogether a good sort, nor a very bad sort, but I'm telling you the real truth in that. It was a sheer accident he stepped off the parapet and fell. Martin went into the base of the tower, and came back saying he was dead. We were both dazed. We separated. He went off to the house I went to my father by a roundabout way. We decided to let things take their course. You all know a great deal of what happened. But later My husband and Martin began to take certain things into their own hands they put me on one side. To this minute I don't quite know how much my father got into their secrets or how little, but I do know that they determined to make what you might call a purse for themselves out of Scarhaven. Martin left certain powers in his brother's hands and went off to London. He was there, hidden, until Andrius got all ready for a flight on the Pike. Then he set off to Scarhaven to join her. But he didn't join her, and none of us knew what had become of him until today, when we heard of what had been found at Scarhaven. That explained it. He had taken that short cut from the Northborough road through the woods behind the Keep, and fallen over the cliff at the Hermit's Steps, but that very night you, Mr. Vickers and Mr. Copplestone and Miss Greyle nearly stopped everything, and if Andrius and Chatfield hadn't carried you off, the scheme would have come to nothing. Well, you know what happened after that." "But," interjected Vickers quickly, "not your share in the last development?" "My share's been to see that the thing was up, and that if I wanted to save them all I'd best put a stop to it," rejoined Addie with a grim smile. "I tell you I didn't know what they'd been up to until today. I was in England never mind where wondering what was going on. Yesterday I got a code message from my husband. When he fetched my father away from you he forced him to tell where that gold was. Then he wired to me by wireless full instructions to recover it during last night. I did. Never you mind the exact means I took, nor who it was that I got to help. I got it, and I took good care to put it where I knew it would be safe. Then this morning I went to meet the two of them at Scarvell's Cut, and I took the upper hand then. I got them away from that sail loft safely. I made my husband give me a code message for the man in charge of the Pike, telling him to return at once to Scarhaven. I made my father write a note to Elkin at the bank, telling him to place the gold which I sent with it to the credit of the Greyle estate. And when all that was done, I got them away. They're gone." Vickers, who had never taken his eyes off Addie during her lengthy explanation, gave her a whimsical smile. "Safely?" he asked. "I'll defy the police to find 'em, anyway," replied Addie with a quick response of lip and eye. "I don't do things by halves. I say they're gone but I'm here. Come, now I've made a clean breast of it all. The thing's over and done with. There's nothing to prevent Miss Greyle there coming into her rights. I can prove 'em my father can prove 'em. So is it any use doing what that old gentleman's just worrying to do? You can all see what he wants he's dying to hand me over to the police." Sir Cresswell Oliver rose, glanced at Audrey and her mother, received some telepathic communication from them, and assumed his old quarter deck manner. "Not tonight, I think, Petherton," he said authoritatively. "No certainly not tonight." Some months later, when Audrey Greyle had come into possession of Scarhaven and had married Copplestone in the little church behind her mother's cottage, she and her husband, to satisfy a mutual and long cherished desire, visited a certain romantic and retired part of the country. And in the course of their wanderings they came across a very pretty village, and in it a charmingly situated retreat, which looked so attractive from the road along which they were walking that they halted and peered at it through its trimly kept boundary hedge. And there, seated in the easiest of chairs, on the smoothest of lawns, roses about him, a cigar in his mouth, the newspaper in his hand, a glass at his elbow, they saw Peter Chatfield. They looked at him for a long moment; then they looked at each other and smiled delightedly, as children might smile at a pleasure giving picture, and they passed on in silence. But when that village lay behind them, Copplestone gave his wife a sly glance and permitted himself to make an epigram. "Chatfield," he said musingly. "Chatfield sublimely ungrateful that he isn't in Dartmoor." End of Scarhaven Keep, by Joseph Smith Fletcher. Recording by Cate Barratt.